My favorite sponsor and your favorite sponsor, apparently, because you guys have been going to palomaverdecbd.com and using code BUCK for 20% off your order quite a bit. I've become their best advertiser, and I'm happy to do that for them because I love them as people. They're a wonderful family. They support this show, and I love their products. They've got all kinds of things, including some new ones because of this new farm bill that's been passed. They've got, of course, regular full-spectrum unflavored CBD tinctures. They've got these new THC-V gummies. They've got the massage oil you know about. They've got the sleeping bundle if you guys need some help sleeping. If you're sore, they have these CBD bath bombs, but me personally, I have to go for the cool menthol sports cream. If you guys lift and work out, it's the most effective sports cream I've ever used. They've got things for your pets, the CBD dog chews, pet tinctures. They've got so much CBD salve. A lot of the stuff now has this THCV in it, and it's a minor cannabinoid found in the Cannabis sativa strain. It's isolated from the hemp plant for their line. A lot of people call it diet weed. Anyway, go check it out. They're wonderful people. These products are really good. They work. I promise you that. I use the products that I advertise. Let's put it that way. And again, it's at palomaverdecbd.com. Enter promo code BUCK at checkout and get you 20% off of your order. Let's get to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, the icon, the hologram graph, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you riding with me yet again this week. I hope you enjoyed the great guests in the month of January. Now we're in the month of February, and I'm starting this month off right with some guys. That's right, plural. There's 2 guests on this episode, and I've had multiple people contact me to have them on. They are here. Conrad and Dmitriy from the World War Now Substack and the podcast. Very, very good stuff. Before we get to these guys, I will tell you, for those of you who subscribe to the YouTube page, you probably already know this. And see, if you don't subscribe, you're left out of this news, except for now when I'm going to tell you. You would have already known, though. I was on the Unregistered podcast with Thaddeus Russell, where for over an hour, I discussed the crazy twists and turns that my life has taken the last year and a half and kind of where this path is going, where it was, things that have happened. So that's on that Thaddeus Russell episode, the Unregistered podcast. Now, the thing is, for his feed, it's behind a paywall, so you can't access it unless you're a paying customer, as it were. But he was generous enough to allow me to put it on the YouTube page. So it is up there. I've received a lot of positive feedback. So if that sounds like something that interests you, go to the YouTube page and first hit subscribe. And then that video is up there. You can watch it. Also, I love the show The Crucible. It's kind of a debate show often. And Andrew Wilson is typically the host over there. I've had his wife, Rachel Wilson, on this show. I was watching the other night and he was inviting some callers to call in to speak with this specific guest that was kind of having some trouble understanding some things. And so I zoomed in, as it is now, Zoom rather than a call, I guess. But I zoomed in. I expected just to have a quick kind of back and forth with the guest, and it turned into a long segment. And so you can watch that, go over to the Crucible's YouTube page. But there's a teaser of it now. I also uploaded this on my YouTube page. The oh-so-great Jim Bob, as in made by Jim Bob. His comic renderings are hilarious. If you don't follow him on Instagram, go do it at Made by Jim Bob. But he also has these great live streams all of the time, really long. This guy's incredibly bright. I need to get him on the show, to be quite honest. But he was cool enough to make a little clip from my quote-unquote appearance on the Crucible. And it had an entertaining, we'll say. He actually put some funny music to it as well. Entertaining back and forth between myself and the guest. I also put that on my YouTube page, so I think you will enjoy that. Give it a shot. Now, let's get to Conrad and Dmitriy from World War Now. Before I get into this episode, let me quickly tell you what these guys do is they cover what they're calling, we are in it, the Third World War. and the political and religious realignment that's going on. There's a lot to this. There's a lot of stuff happening, of course, between Russia and Ukraine, but there's a lot of layers to peel back. It's not just a battle on the ground. There's a bigger warfare at play here. Which side represents what? How about this NATO, New World Order, liberal world order that unfortunately our government is backing, and what they're doing in Ukraine to the true church, and Zelensky himself, what he's doing in his powers? There's a lot at play here. And so we will dive into all of it if we can. These guys are excellent at articulating what's actually happening, the ramifications of what could be at play here down the road. We'll get into it, all of this, with the guys from World War Now. Conrad and Dmitriy, welcome to Counterflow. Glad to finally get y'all on. How are you?
I'm doing great, Buck. It's great to be here. Love being on the fellow orthosphere of podcasts. It's kind of where we like to hang out the most, especially compared to some of the undesirable characters we get in our replies on Twitter. So it's great to be here.
You guys get undesirable replies?
Dmitriy can tell you more about that, I'm sure.
Oh, I think plenty, especially on Twitter, but also, I mean, in the YouTube comments on occasion. I think just being out in the media sphere, Buck, you would understand, like, you know, it's just a matter of dealing with the criticism and taking the trolls alongside with the constructive, you know, feedback. And it's a bit sometimes hard to differentiate between the two. At least that's what I'm finding.
Yes, it used to offend me at times, and now sometimes the more cruel or strangely written critique I get, I sometimes I share them with friends, like, this one's really funny, you know, because at this point, just laugh about it, you know. Let's talk about what you guys are doing, because for one, I have had many of my listeners write to me and in our Telegram group and say, you've got to get these World War Now guys on. They're based and things like this. And I said, well, yeah, I know. I listened to them. So I guess we'll talk about your backgrounds as much as you're willing to divulge, and how you got into politics at all, and then orthodoxy as well, and kind of where you've come from. And we'll start with you, Conrad.
For sure. Yeah. So I've always been involved kind of politics. My family's a bit of a political family, you know, conservative. I was born in the DC area, actually. So I'm a second generation politico there. But as far as my current projects and everything like that, it definitely stems out of my conversion to Orthodoxy. I've been an Orthodox Christian for just over 3 years now. So very early 2020, I was chrismated into the Antiochian Church. And that obviously coincided a little bit with my kind of redeveloping my epistemology, some understanding. I was in college at the time taking epistemology classes, philosophy classes, religion classes. And again, I've always been a conservative. As the world kind of went crazy, I kind of trucked along as, like, you know, becoming more nationalist, more reactionary as the kind of world got crazier, just as a lot of people, I would say, kind of have, who were raised in Christian households. And ever since I became Orthodox, I had already been involved in politics, and I'd kind of thought, like, in my mind, I'm like, what content could I produce that would, you know, bring forward what I know about politics, but really be orthocentric and not just another talking head talking about what they saw on Twitter or on the news recently. And people have described our show as like theopolitics, which I kind of appreciate, because I don't think that a lot of people have their political opinions and then their religious opinions are what they do on Sunday. And that's not to say that there's no distinction between religion and politics. But I think, again, if you're a thinking person, if you're grappling with the big questions of today, your religious epistemology and your underpinning and your tradition are going to inform your politics. And we kind of, with our show, we kind of want to be the ultimate Orthodox worldview show covering current events in the world today. That's kind of the goal.
Yeah, well, you're doing quite well at it. And Dmitry, any of your background you can give us?
Well, yeah, so I grew up in a very intense Orthodox family. So I would be what most people would call a cradle-dox, baptized when I was a young child. And sort of when you grow up in this sort of atmosphere, you do come up with inherently conservative, right-wing, I suppose, opinions about the world. But I was never involved in politics until maybe 19, 18 years of age when I entered university. And then I began attending, events such as CPAC, all of these sort of, you can say, milquetoast political right-wing conservative meetups. And only then did I realize that, hey, some of this Orthodox literature that I was consuming was maybe countered. It didn't exactly align with maybe some of the mainstream conservative opinions, even in my particular country or even in the Western world in general. There was this disconnect. And I always grew up thinking that, hey, look, my ideas were always very conservative. And then I realized there was almost this two conservative streams. And I came at it from this perspective. And in my adulthood, I ended up reading a lot of, just consuming tons of Orthodox Christian literature, as well as, just secular literature as well, kind of trying to align the two. And I think I found a pretty good middle ground, but as always, I'm always growing. And this show is just a continuation of that, where I get to, think about some of the ideas and follow the news.
How did you guys meet?
I messaged, we're mutual friends with David, the real Med White. That would probably be the original connection. But because of that, we knew each other on Discord, Twitter. And one day I just messaged him like, hey, I'm starting a podcast. I'd rather have a co-host than just talk to myself.
Yeah.
Are you interested? And he was the first person I reached out to, and he said yes. So I think that it was Providence there.
Yeah, very nice. We don't even have to talk about who you had at number 2, 3, 4, and 5 on the list. You got number 1, I guess. So I want to ask, before we jump into what's going on geopolitically, because y'all are very in tune and dialed in quite well on that. I want to ask you about just the spirit of this modern age, where we're at right now. And obviously you're going to view it through an Orthodox worldview, which I appreciate. But where are we right now? Is it nihilistic? Is it post-nihilistic? It's certainly, a lot of people call it post-Christian. What do you think of the West, let's say, in the modern age we're in currently right now? What spirit is it?
Well, I think Father Seraphim Rose did call the time when he was writing nihilism. That was the end of the 20th, middle and the end of the 20th century. And I think in many ways, if you listen to our show, at least I talk, Dmitry backs me up, of course, we talk about this idea of a return to the old world of the Anshan regime, with the idea of which in a practical sense involves kings, emperors, clergy kind of being the main aristocracy. But in another sense, it would involve a shrinking of the world from a technological perspective. There's no more of this global consciousness. There's even really barely even a national consciousness. It's much more a local consciousness, a parish consciousness. That's kind of what I consider the real world. And ever since the death of Tsar Nicholas II in the 1960s and 9/11 and then COVID, these kind of big catalysts, these big eras, epochs that kind of segment the centuries that we're in, I believe that we're kind of now entering into what you could call the end of the modern and the beginning of the postmodern. But more detailed than that, it's sort of finally the narrative of the 20th century that both killed the old world and united the new world is collapsing. And the people that lived like them and their parents spent their entire lives inundated in that narrative, which is the post-war narrative of the 20th century, liberalism, democracy, civil rights, all these kinds of things. As that collapses, all sorts of new ideas are emerging. And you see this with the New Age. You see kind of secular new atheism is collapsing a little bit because it had nothing to stand on and is falling for more of these New Age religions, foreign religions, people even converting to things like Orthodoxy, Catholicism, other forms of trad Protestantism, as opposed to the evangelicalism they see in America. All of this is emerging all over the world. My boss, Dr. Steve Turley, who I work with, he talks about the return of civilization states and different civilizations rejecting kind of the global Fukuyama world. And we're seeing that now. And I think with the war in Ukraine, that's kind of the first, it's the most dramatic field in that breakaway, that civilizational revolution kind of that we're seeing since the 21st century began. So I think what we're seeing now is I say we're in the Third World War. That's kind of part of it. Mm-hmm. But I think as before the Third World War becomes what I would consider like the Second World War, and literally like almost every country involved in a military capacity, we're seeing besides Russia, Ukraine, where it is hot, we're seeing the ideological and the theological battlefront of the Third World War happening now. As Metropolitan Neophytos said, we're in the 2.5 year of that Third World War.
Dmitry, what are your thoughts on that?
I completely agree with Conrad, but and just to add to that point, perhaps in the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, when people saw the USSR fall apart and the world become somewhat unipolar, perhaps there was this sense of nihilism, like, okay, this really is the end of history. Like, we really are here at the end and liberal democracy wins and Serbia is being bombed by NATO and this is really it. And then, Desert Storm happens and the world really becomes this boring atheistic place where there's no evidence for God and faith is dead. But now we're saying that old world collapse essentially. And what is arising is, even in the Western nations, for example, we see these movements which are somewhat faith-based, you can almost say. I don't want to say feelings-based, like in a Ben Shapiro sense, but they are faith-based. For example, some of the very progressive movements we're seeing in the West, that the Democrats have sort of supported and fell behind, and even in the EU right now. And in many cases, we can see Ukraine is the most explicit example of that. So Ukraine is based on these almost faith-like, no longer historical or even old Christian doctrines, but these new semi-religious streams of thought. And Zelensky is I guess he's a good example of someone who's building almost like a semi-religion, an ideology behind himself and behind the nation. Like, well, you have all these characters of Bandera, John Locke, kind of walking step in step with these unrelated figures and these people in this new pantheon, I guess. And in the US, you have, movements such as BLM, which, are unrelated to reality. People who look at statistics and things like that. These movements arise because there is a need to, I suppose, believe in something beyond simply, beyond the material. So people need these religious, a religious adherence to something, a movement of some sort. As Conrad said, a new age sort of belief. And unfortunately enough, in Eastern countries, maybe in Central Europe, countries such as Poland, Hungary, Russia, there is this understanding that, hey, we do need to return to something. Perhaps that something needs to be Christianity. And so we see people like Putin, his party, they're actually trying to return to Christianity in some way and trying to reintegrate Christian ideas back into their politics. And that's what me and Conrad essentially commentate on, kind of see how they're all progressing of all that as well. I think beyond the,
beyond the tangible, it seems that there's, past the military fight and past the just surface level politics, there's a spiritual battle at play here that kind of undergirds all of this, it seems like. And I like that you phrased even the other side, as we'll call it, looking for something beyond the material as well, and kind of concocting these newfound, sometimes baseless religions of sorts. We're certainly seeing that in Ukraine with the new church. But if we could pull back and look at what's going on in Ukraine with Russia and the church there, and as kind of symbolic of all of the sides here at play, it's just happening right there in this one small area. How would you describe the sides here? And you can use, you can use countries, you can use alliances, you can use spiritual terms, whatever you guys like. Conrad?
I think a good way to look at this, and this is something I see all the time, especially with some of our detractors who will see something like a map that someone will post, like this is an idea of what could happen if Russia expands in certain spheres of its own influence. And they're like, they call you a LARPer, they call you all sorts of things, and you just make kind of basic political injunctions and ideas. But it's important to recognize that God, as he said, God was not a revolutionary. Christ did not instill this idea of rising up against the moment a ruler decides to oppress you. That's not exactly how it works in Christianity. And when you read, for example, the prophecies of St. Paisios, people know a lot about the prophecies about the invasion of Constantinople by Russia and taking it over, and the war between Turkey and Russia, and then versus NATO, and Greece staying neutral, and all these ideas. And St. Paisios himself, in explicating that very dramatic prophecy that people are like, oh my gosh, is this real? This can't be, whatever. He explicitly says, he's like, look, when Russia does this, it will not be because it wants to help Greece. It will not be because it has some based geopolitical interest to restore Christianity into Constantinople. It'll be because they have their own political interests. And by the grace of God, those interests will happen to help us Greek Orthodox in this context. So it's important to understand that even if a ruler, someone like Putin, who I do believe is sincere in his Orthodox faith, but even if he were literally just a mask on, lying about the whole thing was a show, we know from the Old Testament extensively that God uses the whims and the plans and the machinations of evil secular rulers for his own ends. I mean, just read about Nebuchadnezzar, who ended up actually becoming a saint. But before that, he literally was persecuting, he was one of the biggest persecutors of the saints and prophets of God in all of the Old Testament. Yet his empire was used to castigate the Jews for what they were doing. His empire was used to elevate the words of Daniel and the prophetic words of the Israelis and of the Jews in exile. And so to understand that there will always be countries taking sides, and there will even be, I think, moral judgments. Like, I believe that in the future, you could say, for example, if the U.S. goes to war with China over Taiwan, I wouldn't personally have a problem saying the U.S. is in the wrong here, sending all these troops to die thousands of miles away. That is true in a moral sense. But then from an eschatological or a prophetic or a meta-narrative perspective, there could be there could be a few discrepancies between, the sides of the Third World War and how God is using his instruments. That being said, generally speaking, I think when it comes to something like Israeli politics, NATO politics, these are institutions, whether it's the Israeli government, whether it's NATO, whether it's the European Union, these are institutions right now that are more in line with the archetype of Antichrist than perhaps the other side. So to look at it from that perspective, as Patriarch Kirill just said, any attempt to destroy Russia will result in the destruction of the world. this sort of, we're kind of reaching that level where on the geopolitical front, the background is having an effect on how the lines are drawn. That spiritual plane is having an effect on how the lines are being drawn in the physical realm.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a moment. I don't think we're quite there yet. I see a moment coming where Americans, maybe even of the boomer generation more so than younger than that, but the ones who have always stood by and supported the troops, kind of rah-rah right conservatives, there's going to be a tough pill to swallow, it seems like, when they have to understand that the U.S. military is not only not necessarily fighting for their conservative Christian traditions, but possibly against them. Do you see that at all, Dmitry?
Yes, I think so. And it's really unfortunate that the Biden regime has used, I guess, now that the US has pulled out of Iraq, has pulled out of Afghanistan, it's almost like this time of peace in the last 20 years, we've reached it. And now everybody can relax and kind of introspectively, improve their own lives at home, and the troops can finally rest. And, we can kind of go back to, say, reforming the military and improving the morale, some of the ethics. But no, Biden and the Democrats, they go against that, and they instead begin providing not just training, but also billions of dollars of equipment to Ukraine. It's almost like Afghanistan is over. Now let's open up a new front in this weird proxy-like way. But I think Americans right now are even more challenged, like perhaps some of those, people of the boomer generation were a bit confused as to why we are in Afghanistan. But now that was over, and suddenly they're challenged again. And it's almost as if their minds are going to be psyoped and attacked throughout their entire lives. Now that the boomers are in their 60s and 70s, it's almost like there is no rest for them. Their taxpayer dollars will be exploited until they are in nursing homes, and even after that. So it's really unfortunate. It's how the U.S. Military-industrial complex is abusing this rich class of the United States citizens and kind of using them as fuel to find all these objectives overseas. And now Ukraine is that objective on the table now. So very unfortunate, I think.
Conrad?
I agree. And I think in our last episode, if people listen to it, Dmitry outlined just the amount of effort that we're going, not just to send our own stuff, to pressure other countries, to basically demilitarize themselves, sending things over to Ukraine. And we're seeing, the Nord Stream 2 destruction was a big, I think you could say, red pill to some people who are like, all right, it's so obvious that our government did this. Yet fundamentally, the basis of my quote unquote conservatism for these past 20 years for the past 20 years, the Republican Party has abandoned any kind of social conservatism ever since the loss of Pat Buchanan in the Republican primary in the early 90s. But because of that, they've kind of been, I would say, coping with the rah-rah military stuff because it's masculine. It's you can always justify it as defending freedom at home, no matter how amorphous perhaps that goal becomes. It was a really strong anchor, of course, notwithstanding all of the Iraq propaganda and 9/11 and all that kind of stuff. But with all of that in mind, it is going to be interesting to see if there's going to be perhaps you could call a critical mass of anger that could come with those people, especially as their children reject joining the military, or even they tell them, hey, I don't want you joining the military. One, I don't want you dying for some silly nonsense overseas. And two, if people are paying it, I don't know if you paid attention to this, Buck, but whether it's at Fort Hood or some of these other huge military bases around the country, the culture in the military of the United States is collapsing.
Yes.
There's extreme drug institutional problems. There's infiltration by the cartels from Mexico on some of these bases in the South. There are extreme sexual lasciviousness and stuff going on beside the bases, female hypergamy. And it's all amalgamating into what I believe is going to possibly lead to an extremely humiliating, huge military defeat from the United States in perhaps a military theater of the next 30 years with a rival power, Russia, China, Iran, something like that. I believe what we're seeing with as those military stock from back in the day, from Vietnam, from even Iraq, Afghanistan, as their children and grandchildren don't join up like they perhaps hoped as they established a career for themselves in the military, our military is going to, I think, quickly lose its place as the most formidable known fighting force. Even if we might take America might still assert some global victories. In the general, the decline in the quality of our troops and organization is objectively going down.
Yeah, I think the same thing on the academic front about universities, because you alluded to people sending their kids, well, you got to go off to the military. That's just a thing that happened. It also happens to be that a lot of them just, you got to go to the university after you finish high school. But I've seen even, I'm not trying to only pick on boomers, but I've seen that generation with children entering college, or I guess to age myself, my generation with kids entering college, saying they'd rather them go into a trade at this point than necessarily just go to college. It's what you do, unless you're going to specifically be something that you need a university degree for. That a lot of people are wanting their children, why don't you look into a trade? Because so-and-so's kids went to that university and they came back looking completely different and they hated their parents all of a sudden. So it's interesting to see if certain institutions that are so American in nature start to collapse over the next decade or so, like what comes out of those ashes. But I'm digressing just a bit. I want to talk about Ukraine and Russia specifically. There's so much propaganda. I told y'all before we started recording, you guys are one of the outlets I go to when to learn about what is going on over there, along with Jim Jatras, that we both have great respect for. Obviously, the propaganda it's a war. So there's propaganda as far as the eye can see on these things. And for a long time, I've heard stuff that from people saying, well, Putin is still a communist. And just the ridiculous things. And I heard for a while, Ukraine's going to just wipe Russia off the map. Russia's way in over their head. And then it started getting quiet. Then I quit hearing any reports at all, interestingly enough, unless I go to find out like truth and facts from people like you guys. So I guess we'll say broadly what's been happening there, and then we can get into the specifics of where you think things are going and whatnot. But I'll let either one of you take this one first.
Dmitry?
Yes, at the moment, Buck, as a lot of the listeners may be aware, the fighting has become very localized. So essentially, in the center east of the Ukraine, the fighting is still ongoing. You may have heard of the city named Bakhmut. There's a lot of fighting going on there. The city has been besieged essentially by both sides. The city is kind of like a neutral middle ground. Both sides have artillery shelling it day in, day out. Almost, they're saying, double digits artillery shells per day from either side. The city's it's been completely evacuated, firstly, but secondly, it's essentially just a battle zone, like you can imagine from almost like a video game of sorts. And both sides are fighting to take it, but at this point, no one's quite sure exactly what strategic purpose the city holds. Now, in regards to what's the next step, because Russia does have the numbers advantage. Russia is looking at this major city in the center of Ukraine named Zaporozhye, which has a population of just under 1 million, about 700,000. It has been reduced as population has been evacuated, but Russia taking this city will essentially mean a huge moral as well as statutory legal victory for Russia, because Putin on paper has already declared that this city belongs to Russia all the way back in September, October last year, when he signed the amendment into the Russian constitution stating that, well, this city has apparently voted to join the Russian Federation. So Russia now is kind of pushing towards the city of Zaporozhye in order to, I guess, free it in the Russian rhetorical sense from, the Ukrainian occupiers. And that's kind of going to be in the headline for the next 2 months, whether or not Russia can actually take this gigantic city, because at this point, Russia hasn't really been able to take a city of that major size. Notice how early on we heard, well, Kiev's being, the Russians are dropping on the Kiev airport. The Russians did capture the Kiev airport. There was talked about tanks, just lines of tanks driving towards Kiev, towards Kharkiv, all these major cities. But the Russians since, March, April of last year, they have retreated from all these positions. Russians haven't been able to actually take any of these major cities yet. So, me and Conrad are discussing in our last few episodes, like, are the Russians going to be able to actually besiege a city and without either side actually destroying it, leveling it, actually, kind of bringing it back into, I guess, into a peaceful time without, damaging most of the infrastructure? It'll be kind of a good observation to make, I guess. That's our prognosis.
Conrad?
No, I completely agree with what he's saying. And again, we're seeing fog of war. It's so hard because, you'll hear reports of, 17-kilometer advance, and then maybe there will be a retreat in the next day, or maybe a little bit of bluff, or maybe a little bit. It's so hard because the Russian military, the Ukrainians a bit less so, but they do actually have OPSEC. They try not to just, put out all of their plans on day one. So it's hard to do your best to get a reading, to not report on what you think is going to happen and then have it called back 24 hours later, especially in the digital age when you hit publish and these things all happen. But on the ground, when Dmitry talks about bringing these places into peacetime or moving forward, this isn't to say that we don't recognize the facts on the ground that these are bloody wars, and if for Russia to advance, that people are going to die, civilians included, and that's a tragedy. And we ask everyone to keep that whole situation in prayer. But on the ground, the church is experiencing extreme persecution, some of the worst levels of just overt, like soldiers walking into churches and arresting people, crazy people walking in and stabbing priests. These are the kinds of things that happen in Ukraine, including along the areas even by the front line. And when the Russian troops and when the Russian forces actually take a city, and there actually are then no more Ukrainian forces, and they're actually then enforcing military law and order there, the violence against those priests and those parishioners of the canonical church ends. And if that makes me a Russian Putin propagandist to say that I hope more of that can happen, then I'll take the label. Okay, I'll take that, because that's what's important to me. And I think that's what's important to most Orthodox Christians in all of this. And when some Polish person or some person on NBC so callously calls someone in America or in the West or somewhere that knows people that are part of this canonical church, that understands the ecclesiology, that understands the drastic nature of the sin of schism, as well as the geopolitical implications of the ecumenical patriarch and all of that's going on. You can't just say, oh, well, it's neutral, let the Ukrainians have their church, let the people that want to go. Like, that's not how the church and ecclesiology works. And that's not to say that there are people in Ukraine that may have some more legitimate grievance than others to perhaps support their government and the Kiev regime and Zelensky. But I think that justification is waning every day.
Mm-hmm. Do you guys miss purely political talk on this show? Because if you do, well, I hope you're enjoying what we're doing. But there are still great outlets for purely political and fun libertarian shows. Amongst the top of that list should be Lions of Liberty. I love these guys. I've known Brian and John for a long time. Lions of Liberty is one of the greatest and longest running libertarian/anarchist podcast networks in the world. Quite simply, they started a long time ago, so they know what they're doing. On Monday, John Odermatt delivers a powerful mix of inspiration, health, and faith to set your mind, body, and soul free with Finding Freedom. That's his show. And then, of course, every Wednesday, y'all know Brian McWilliams will make you laugh at all this craziness going on in this world. He even provides a bit of a promise of a better future with his show, Mean Age Daydream. And then Friday, they include shows like Meme Wars or Hate Watch, or, of course, a show that I was on myself, the infamous, or is it just famous? I don't know. But it's libertarians in living rooms drinking liquor. That's on Fridays. That was a very fun show to be a part of. If you go back in their old episodes of that one, I think there's some quite hilarious moments in there. Lions of Liberty is the first step to finding freedom. Listen today to the Lions of Liberty Network, everywhere podcasts are found. Let's get back to this show. Do either of you guys think that this is a war of aggression, and let's say maybe uncalled for aggression on the side of Russia invading Ukraine? Is Russia at fault for completely at fault for starting this?
So I think initially, maybe from the get-go, President Putin, in his initial 40-minute speech on February the 24th, when the special military operation was announced, Putin made it very clear that there are certain objectives that Russia needs to meet. One of them, demilitarization of the Ukraine. One was this denazification, which we've never heard about before, but it's been announced officially, and now it's kind of become political jargon at this point, a reality of sorts. And I mean, all the footage of the neo-Nazi memorabilia and all of that kind of solidifies that point, for better or for worse. And the third objective was, of course, to save Donbass, that region of Donetsk and Lugansk, those two cities which the Ukrainian military has besieged for, almost 9 years now, since 2014. So essentially, Putin made it very clear from the get-go that this was a defensive war. And interestingly enough, the Russian church fully supported this perspective. And we're talking the Russian church being in the tens of millions of people, almost 100 million people in membership. They have, every single Russian bishop has, whether or not they like the war or not. I don't think any of them like it. And I don't think any of them, fully support, the fact that, killing needs to be done. But they are saying that, look, Donbass was sieged by the Ukrainian military, as well as these various neo-Nazi battalions for almost 8 years. And we've been praying and asking the Ukrainian presidents, Poroshenko first and then Zelensky after them, to stop this madness that was going on the borders there of Donetsk for years now. And And that's sort of the perspective that the Russian church fully stands behind Putin. And the Russian church doesn't necessarily call it an act of aggression. They're saying it's a defensive war, funny enough. And I know that this really doesn't line up with anything the Western media is saying, that, it's an invasion, calling it even an invasion of sorts. The Russian military and the Russian media is asserting that this is almost like a peacekeeping operation in a way. That's why they continue to call it a special military operation, and war has not been officially announced. Whether or not this is true or not, this is the facts. Even Patriarch Kirill, he's referring to it as a war in a sort of metaphysical way, but he still calls it the special military operation. So there is this understanding, as cliche as it may seem, that it is similar to what, say, the US and NATO nations did in Iraq. It was a peacekeeping operation to save Kuwait. And I know that sounds a little bit, abusive, based on your relationship to the Iraq war and your views on it, but it is a very similar situation here. Yeah.
Well, the main difference, of course, being that Ukraine and Russia share a 1,000-kilometer border, and Iraq and United States are thousands and thousands of miles away. But not only that, I think the only fault, at least I personally would put on the Russians, and you can read this, I got the receipts on this. If you read my newsletter that I used to run back in 2019, The American Byzantine, I explicitly said, Russia may realize that they should have done what they needed to do in 2014 and destroyed the Ukrainian military when it had 5,000 active servicemen, as opposed to when it became the most powerful military in Europe with the funding of NATO and the United States and the Brits and everybody under the sun. And so if you could, insofar as the people in the Donbass are still experiencing suffering and children are still have pedal bombs that literally look like leaves dropped on them, so that when they pick them up, they blow off their limbs, that's still happening. And to say that Russia perhaps could have prevented that 8-9 years ago, that could be something you could put on their plate. But no, the idea that it's that it's Hitler too, and that he's running in and they're going to genocide Ukrainians, and that it's just some psychotic attack. I mean, that's an attempt at the return of the 20th century narrative that the powers that be are trying to bring back. And thankfully, it's not working, because even the other side who are against Russia, half of them seem to be okay with Mustache Man now, which I thought that was something we weren't allowed to do anymore. So you get banned from Twitter for posting a David Irving quote, but then you can post Black Suns all you want, and it's okay because you're supporting Ukraine. Which it shows you that just shows you that we're not returning back to the post-war consensus anytime soon. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's funny. You guys seem almost optimistic on just at the broad level, and I am as well. But when I hear y'all speak on the current age kind of ending, and there's some new alliances being formed, and we're kind of entering a spiritual age of sorts, I think that's a good thing, as opposed to where we've been the last decade or, century, really. Do y'all see it in an optimistic light?
Absolutely. I think a lot of Orthodox people do see it, and Christians in general, whether they be Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, because on one hand, the current world order, the current reigning liberal ideology around the world, it's essentially coming to head. It's finally reared its head, and it's said, look, we actually don't like Christians. We don't like what you stand for.
Right.
And we're actually openly against you now. So the war is in the open, as opposed to in the 80s and 70s when it was like a cold kind of approach from them. And you couldn't really see it creep up on you until your kids were indoctrinated, after high school and college. Now it's really open. It's essentially an open war in the West. And it seems in the East, it's almost a hot war at this point. So I think we're optimistic insofar as the facts on the ground that countries need to turn to their Christian roots in order to survive what's coming in the future, as well as some of the prophecies, which of course I think our podcast is pretty known for. Some of the Christian prophecies, not necessarily Roman Catholic, although we do make references somewhat to that particular religion, but Orthodox Christian prophecies, which over the last 100 years there have been an absolute abundance of, which cannot be ignored, from Greek saints, Russian saints, even Ukrainian saints, I want to say, saints from Belarus and saints from Ukraine, which we make references to almost in every single episode. And these prophecies are essentially clairvoyant Christian saints speaking about future events. And yes, there are talks about calamities and tragedies, but also of this hopeful rebirth of the Christian civilization in Europe. And necessarily it does involve Russia. So that's kind of the positive note on a metaphysical end for us.
Conrad?
I totally agree. And I think your question is so good because it almost poses the question in general on Christians about like the apocalypse and the end of the world. Not saying that that's like The apocalypse both is and isn't happening because, the end of the world started when Jesus, came back and rose from the dead. That was the beginning of the end of the world. All that was left, that he came, and then the second coming after he ascended, that's what's next, is the second coming, right? In the life of the church. And I think to ask someone, are you happy about the end of the world? That's a hard question because as an Orthodox Christian, someone who partakes of the sacraments, someone who I believe I have a relationship with Jesus Christ, his church, and that I believe that if I ascend to heaven, I'm confident in my stake, at least as best as someone can be. And I think that being said, we know what comes with the end of the world, and it's Antichrist, and we know that there is weeping and gnashing of teeth after this life for many. So it's to have that in our current state where we still have our gnomic will to kind of grasp, to look forward to the things of the future in God, as opposed as also understanding that many will fall away. It's hard to see that. And like Dmitry said, we do see, and in our previous episode, we even mentioned the idea of the restrainer, and there is the idea of the emperor as a restrainer of the Antichrist, and that there will be, and we talked about the prophecies of St. Joseph the Hezekiah, St. Paisios, Elder Ephraim, about the future reign of a marble king who will perhaps usher in an era of total evangelism to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth before the Antichrist finally comes and the deception really begins for the last time, that the type of Antichrist is completed with the final Antichrist himself. And I think just to understand that as Christians, there will be the separation of the wheat from the tares in that regard. And if you are, in the wheat, you realize that you are getting closer and closer to the final kingdom. But if you're in the chaff, then you would see the end of the world as in we're total, it's over, black pill, like that. Like they exist at the same time in that regard. Right. And you also often hear the expression, well, it has to get worse before it gets better. And in a lot of ways, as material conditions and people see things get so crazy in the West, a lot of people are just forced to come to repentance and to Christ. And that's a scary thing, but it can be a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm. What do y'all have I know you get accused of certain things or slandered for certain ideas in your view of what a government should be. Can you each give me kind of a discussion of how you view, not the perfect government, there isn't such a thing, but if you had your way, what government would you choose? Style of government, I should say.
Well, in my humble opinion, I think the perfect style of government needs to begin from the top down. So the ruler of the state, the head of the state, the person who appears on the coins needs to be an Orthodox Tsar or an emperor, which these two terms are synonymous in case you do hear them. At least in the Russian language, Tsar means Caesar, and Caesar is an emperor at least in the Greek sense. So the rule needs to be an autocrat, which means unbound by any laws. The only thing binding the ruler at the top needs to be Orthodox tradition and the gospel. And of course, the emperor's confessor, who, it'll be either a priest or a bishop. Now, after the emperor, of course, there'll be cabinets of ministers, perhaps even a parliament, or perhaps even a senate, which existed in the Roman Empire as well as in the Russian Empire, which discussed legislation actually, because these are all former lawyers and legislators, actually write down the laws. Those laws later go up to the emperor and he signs them or vetoes them as he prefers. I'm not necessarily of the opinion that a Duma or an actual elective body needs to have some sort of say in the political running of a nation. I think these things have been shown to become very dangerous, especially in the late history of the Russian Empire, especially with secret societies infiltrating these elective bodies, especially Freemasonry.
Yeah.
And the church has post factum condemned Freemasonry, seeing what happened in the Russian Revolution. Unfortunately, too late. A lot of the church officials didn't recognize Freemasonry as a danger until the 1930s. So Orthodox Christians were quite late, to that particular discussion. And I think even Catholics were. I mean, many people in Europe. But so an elective body, not necessarily, but locally in terms of townships, village elections. This is an old Russian tradition, as well as I'm sure Greeks had, their own polis democracies, city councils, elections can be held there. And of course, governance could be had locally, and, mayors and such figures could be, of course, elected locally. This is a completely Christian thing, as well as you can even see this on a very local level, beginning at parish councils, where the parish councils elect treasurers and people to support the priest. And I mean, it starts from there. Of course, at the top, there needs to be a complete trust and faith in not just the bishops running the church, because, we do need to place some sort of necessary faith in bishops that they will reign autocratically in some way. Like there really isn't much oversight over the power of bishops in the church. And of course, that's reflected in the Orthodox emperor as well. There really isn't much oversight over the emperor, and there needs to be a certain faith that, the Christian emperor at the top will reign properly and correctly. But that's, unfortunately, there is no real way around that besides prayer. And I mean, we can go into the nuances, and me and Conrad will publish papers, regarding Orthodox monarchy in depth, but that's my sort of idea. So, very strict dictatorial rule at the top, you can say, in a church sense as well as in a secular sense. And as we go lower to the bottom, a lot more democracy. And in terms of economics, I'm not sure I'll want to get into that. I do think this rampant capitalism does need to be addressed. I'm not sure in which way. I feel like there are, specialists on economics who could probably discuss, exactly how could we stem this idea of the free market, this, rampant pornographic, like people selling their bodies, all these weird nuances which didn't exist in the Russian Empire or any Christian state prior to the 21st century. Like, these things do need to be addressed and also, kind of confronted on a legislative basis. But at this point, that's kind of my stance, generally speaking. So I'll let Conrad go.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I couldn't have said it really better myself there as far as the extensive kind of mechanical explanation. I think in many ways it just involves, who was the last Christian emperor? Tsar Nicholas II is a canonized saint, a confessor. Just read his life, read his writings. He did not want to give up the autocratic power of the emperor in 1905 when he opened up the legislature and the Duma to being a more powerful representative body and having actual sway and legislation and able to, have more influence over what the emperor does. He was against that. He had to cave, of course, due to political pressure and attempts at revolution. But reading his justifications and reading what he wrote about the need for autarky and the symphonia between the church and the state that you hear so much about from the Byzantine Empire carried over into the Russian Empire, many viewing that as one of the justifications for Moscow being viewed as the third Rome. But I have two books over here that I almost wish I could get up and just grab. But I want everybody to read, to understand this idea better. Read the book, History of Central Banking by Stephen Mitford Goodson, who's a former central banker, head of the South African Central Bank. He's dead now, but he has a fantastic chapter in that book about the Russian Central Bank and the role of Russian monarchy in preserving a nation against predatory finance and capital. And Russia had a currency that was printed from the treasury that wasn't connected to a central bank. There was no interest, and they were able to regulate their money supply and their goods to the point where as even William Taft said, the president of the US, the Tsar of Russia has created a workers' paradise far above any Western democracy. That was what he said before the Tsar was assassinated. And another book I have by Count Major Shirab Spiridovich, who was a courtier of the Tsar. He wrote a book called The Hidden Hand, which is maybe one of the most intense conspiracy books you'll ever read. But he has an entire chapter in it about where he basically lists the last four Tsars were all assassinated, murdered, poisoned by world Zionism, world finance in their attempts to end the banks, establish Christ as the head of these nations, and establish and maintain the tradition of true Christian empire. As we talked about in our last episode, the idea of the restrainer of Antichrist and the forces of our world today that were manifesting in the 18th and 19th centuries did everything they could to take out those emperors. So I think if you look into those materials and whatnot, I think our version of government, you'll see, as we say, this is the return to the old way. And that's not to say that we can just copy paste an old method onto now. There would have to be some updates. There would have to be some contextualization. There would have to be some, it would have to all be in context of the things that have happened in the past 90, 100, 110 years. But generally speaking, it would finally just be, as opposed to, this is the best system of government. No, in reality, there's just one system of government. Right. It actually usually manifested that way. We're just finally finally taking out some trash.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Zionists or Zionism, the spirit of Zionism, the power of Zionism is waning at all, or is it still causing or behind a lot of the evil that we're seeing in this world? We can answer this carefully if we need to.
Yes. Well, I guess I'll start. I'm just going to say, in the context of the Ukrainian conflict, I think what we're seeing here, and mind you, if we're speaking about Zionism in particular, Ukraine was home to many of the people who may have subscribed to that particular ideology in the early 20th century. And Ukraine was always known for its, let's just say, perhaps anti-Semitic leanings. In terms of, perhaps you've read some of the pogroms that occurred. And those pogroms were not state sanctioned. St. Nicholas II did not approve of them. These were just, people in the villages upset, causing riots, essentially. Not saying they're similar to BLM riots or anything of that sort, but they were just civil unrest. And so the Ukrainian nation, in many ways, was a great place where these things were taking place. Now, just to mention, there are of course, there is the modern consideration where you have members of, that particular political leaning actually, operating in the Ukraine in a sort of fully fledged, out in the open way. You see these oligarchs like Kolomoisky running the Azov battalion. You see people like Zaluzhny hanging out with the chief, representatives of certain religions. You have people like Zelensky himself. And then you have, the most famous journalist in Ukraine who runs a huge YouTube channel, millions of subscribers, Dmitry Gordon. Now, Dmitry Gordon is not a Christian. He belongs to a certain other religion as well as a certain other. So you have these elites of Ukrainian society, not necessarily. And it's almost as if it's, dare I say, a humiliation ritual of sorts.
Yeah.
And we see that it's like a bashing. And Solzhenitsyn writes about this in one of his Archipelago Gulag, book. He actually mentions that it's almost like revenge for past sins that the Ukrainian people have committed on, say, certain folks.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where I'll stop. And I think that's why we're seeing these really weird manifestations of these mixtures of ideologies in the Ukraine. It's almost as if not just a punishment for Russians, but the actual ethnic Ukrainians as well, perhaps.
Conrad?
Really, really well said, Dmitry. I think a good way to think about this as well is Putin, again, he's not the czar, but for the historical enemies of Russia, he may as well be. And I think Norm Eisen, Barack Obama's former ambassador to the Czech Republic and czar on government ethics, actually a very high-ranking deep state official, ultra-Zionist, of course, when he was appointed the ethics czar for Obama, his mother said, "Oh, well, this is the first time we'll have a czar that was good for the Jews." And so, and this is a person who's like, this is a modern man who's a very powerful government official. And he admitting that in his family, he was still taught and brought up in the society that the ultimate villain is the czar, even more than he brought up the czar, not even Hitler. And people always talk about how before Hitler, kind of the boogeyman in this was the czar. And before that, it was kind of, people would refer to the pharaoh still from like back in the day in the Old Testament, which is a much more grounded, I think, historical, civilizational boogeyman, if you are to have one. But the disdain for Russia, the disdain for this nation that, again, Russia went from autocratic czardom to autocratic communism, now back to whatever the hell it is now, kind of figuring itself out. And because of that, it never embraced this liberal democracy thing. And it's because, and you could say that's because of the Holy Spirit. Some would say it's some innate thing in the Russian people. For better or for worse, Russia has been one of the only, what you could call even semi-European country that has been completely insulated, you could say, from the mind rot that is true democracy. And that is, and we know that the Soviet Union was initially very critical in the initial founding of Israel. And before the founding of the state of Israel, the biggest patrons of the Christians in the Holy Land were the czars of Russia. And now we see Russia also still being one of the biggest patrons of Christians in the Holy Land. And we've discussed on one of our episodes how that may be a point of contention because Putin himself is kind of, he tries to play both sides with Israel, Palestine, with Iran, with Syria, and all these sorts of things. At a certain level, if you really are the leader of a Christian civilization state, you're going to have to reckon with the fact that the non-Christians, especially, the government in Israel, the Zionist government, they openly persecute the church there. And how is the Christian patrons of those places in Russia and the former empire that used to be their salvation on earth, their patronage, the reason they still exist, how are they going to square that two circles with the geopolitical situation, but with the spiritual reality?
Yeah, well put. I guess just this a quick touch because I kind of already know the answer. I've heard y'all discuss it, but there is a segment of my audience that would consider themselves libertarian. What are your thoughts in a nutshell on libertarianism? I know Dmitry really loves it, so I'll let him go first.
Well, look, I think the modern world, libertarianism has met sort of these challenges essentially. So we have, the freedom of speech, how do I put it? Well, libertarianism and the idea that, everybody interacts amongst one another. And, there's kind of like this eye for an eye dynamic where you don't cause harm to somebody else. And, we all live in peace. Libertarianism, I think, meets these challenges. I think if Conrad wants to start on this topic, I don't really want to interrupt. Yeah, Conrad, do you want to go?
Sure. I think with libertarian, I'm stumbling there a little bit.
Yeah,
but
sorry.
With libertarianism, I believe I called it kind of the formalization of the lack of the greatest commandment in society. Like, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love your neighbor as yourself. Libertarianism says you actually don't have to do any of that. And that's not to say that you can be a true good neighbor to someone or truly love Christ and God with a gun to your head being compelled. But that's a bit of a simplification and a kind of creation of a false dialectic as to what a religious civilization really does, what it means to kind of mandate religion on a society. And it is what we're seeing in Russia. It means you do have restrictions on imagery and speech that goes against your epistemological foundation, your faith, your Christ, your God. You're like, freedom of speech can exist without you being able to, put pornography on a billboard or make piss Christ like the artist did in the US. Like that, many people have believed in freedom of speech throughout history with saying that, of course, a society can limit those sorts of things. And with libertarianism, libertarianism was on the fringe because it was never, as I say, real libertarianism has never been tried. Mm-hmm. So libertarians they can always say that the state came in and corrupted their perfect little idea with just a little pinch of statism. So therefore, we need to try the NAP again. We need to try this, everyone doing their own thing. And fundamentally, that will never happen. I was going to bring this up earlier when we were talking about monarchy, and I'm by no means that, I disagree with so much of what Curtis Yarvin says. But one of the great points that he makes is that fundamentally, every institution is a monarchy. And the most effective institutions are run as the most effective monarchies. And we're talking whether it's a police station, corporation, a government. And how could a representative government be a monarchy? Well, if you look at the early America, many would say that after Thomas Jefferson, for a whole kind of cycle of American politics, Alexander Hamilton operated with effective monarchical control over the political system in America, with the process of democracy basically just unfolding as a pretext as he got his way behind the scenes. And every institution is run that way, at least ones that are effective. And to then apply that idea to government means if we want the government to work for people and to work in a godly way, the most effective way is through this method of Christian monarchy. And libertarianism combined with representative government, it's basically institutionalized oligarchy, as now you have a million vectors of influence and power within your representative government, within the lobbying community now that's developed around it, where rich people can just have their way. And I think libertarianism will always be, this is not a new idea, but a tool for oligarchs to win people over with these ideas. And then the mechanism on the ground will just always give them more power.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, you mentioned Yarvin there, do you think he's an honest actor?
Well, based on our last question and his background, maybe not, but I think I don't like a lot of what he says about conspiracies, actually. I think his rejection of what you could call the hard conspiracy is kind of him filling in the gaps for his whole thing about the cathedral. He thinks it's all this kind of natural process of human existence and these bureaucracies develop. And then it's kind of, nobody actually made the decision for that to happen. It just kind of happened. And that's true. But people also people with power make decisions and influence centuries and move money around and start wars and bank spy people and assassinate. That's all true. So for him to just kind of push that aside as silly conspiracy because he came up with the big brain mechanism as to why things happen, I think that's a bit kind of like smelling your own farts.
Dmitry, any thoughts there?
You're too good to believe in a crazy conspiracy theory.
Sure.
I think Curtis Yarvin Kurt Moldbug is worth reading, but whether or not he should be being the primary thought leader that one should follow, or even in the top 10, say, influences on one particular political thoughts, probably not. I think it's sort of like you'd follow people on Twitter, big accounts, but don't necessarily subscribe to everything they're posting. Like I follow Ben Shapiro, for example, but I don't agree with his libertarian stances based on all the reasons above Conrad just stated, the NAP not being applicable, things of that nature. But Moldbug, I do think it's worth kind of looking at what he's saying and sort of perhaps maybe he'll give a different perspective on a modern issue. Like he does analyze modernity in a certain somewhat interesting way, especially the news cycle, the way he speaks about, modern politics, Trump, sometimes Biden, referencing modernity in a pretty, I think is quite smart.
Yeah.
But again, just referencing back to what I said, I don't think he should be a primary thought leader of any sort, only because he himself does not seem very grounded. He does have this sort of agnostic approach where he's like, well, I'm not going to tell you how to think. This is my opinion, and none of these conspiracies have any sort of weight behind them. But we're saying, hold on, but we have evidence that, say, the Russian Revolution of 1917 occurred, Maidan 2013 occurred, the Yeltsin Revolution, the Gorbachev, the falling apart of the USSR. These were all miniature or large conspiracies of some sort, which have caused a tremendous impact on world history. And yet Moldberg is saying, well, no, it's a sort of natural occurrence, and you can kind of analyze it from the top down. I don't think he's right.
Okay. Before we get out of here, we've discussed where things are currently, and y'all have both stated where you think broadly things are going. And again, we all agree that that's fairly optimistic. I think so. But in the next few years, that's what everyone likes to talk about. We all have short attention spans. Where do you see things playing out in the next 3 years? We can talk Russia, Ukraine. We could talk America, globally, anything like that, culturally, religiously, anything y'all see that you'd like to discuss that's coming up in the next handful of years here.
I think in many ways, there's a few big things that we've hinted at on our show, whether it's the expansion of the front, as in it's not just going to be Russia, Ukraine troops clashing, like other militaries and countries engaging their army in a way. I think that is very contingent. I mean, this is hard. Like, I'm just straight making predictions here. This is contingent, I think, on the Turkish 2023 presidential election. That's going to be one of the most consequential events of our time. Forget 2024 in America. I've yet to see a person in America, or maybe Kanye West, but I've yet to see how he could win. Besides him, I've yet to see someone that would do anything different, really, than what's going on foreign policy-wise on the American stage. But if Erdogan loses and the NATOists and the pro-Western people take power there, that is just going to change the game in such a major way that I think it's going to, from a geopolitical perspective, it's going to be really interesting. And as those things happen, that could be one of the catalysts for big cultural change in America. Like, how would the American public respond to like a mobilization, again, like an American war, like Vietnam or even like Iraq or Afghanistan, something even a little bit bigger than that? How would the American psyche, how would American religion, how would American institutions respond to that? And I have no idea when this will happen, but Elder St. Joseph the Hesychast had made overtures to his disciple Elder Ephraim that America will be Orthodox. And I believe that in his life and time in America, the rapid growth with which Elder Ephraim was able to expand so many monasteries, I think shows, as somebody with an Orthodox phronema, I have not acquired the Orthodox phronema, don't mishear me, as someone who's trying and possesses an Orthodox worldview, the seeds were laid for something. God doesn't, the seeds are here for a reason. And I think in the next 40 years, I'm not writing off an Orthodox revival in the United States. Call me a larper all you want. I'm praying for that. I'm interested in that. I think that could be something that we see. That's not to say that America will immediately experience political decline on the world stage. Depending on how quickly that war happens, though, that's going to be when that starts.
Oh, I think, Conrad, you're spot on. And I would just say that not just an Orthodox revival in the US, but in many Western nations, I think it's possible, as well as in maybe the nations of the second world, for example, the second world in brackets, but countries such as South America. And look, I think Russia and all these Eastern nations now rising to the forefront, Russia, Belarus, giving us an alternative to this degenerate, progressive, liberal ideology, which has been reigning over the last 30 years. This is probably the brightest thing we can see on the horizon, the brightest star. And it's the star of Christ. It's the star of, his nativity. Russia is like a beacon of Christianity, for better or for worse, and not in any, not in its perfect form, but it is shining an alternative for those people, especially in Western rich nations living in abundance, that look, there is an alternative, and this alternative has Christian on it. And you can actually embrace it in your own local nations. For example, in the USA, you can attend an Orthodox church. You can locally embrace this ideology and this religion for your family. You can save them from whatever's coming in the future. And what's coming, I think, and this is where we get to the prognosis stages, I think it's going to be quite bad. We see under the Trump presidency, he did hold back the wave, but as we can see, the degeneracy of the last maybe I think since the second term of Obama, it's really ramped up. And following people like Alex Jones, he's covered it pretty in depth. Things are speeding up. Things are accelerating very, very hard. That's why we see a lot of support for countries such as Russia, even though Russia is not perfect, but we do see Americans, Western Europeans saying, look at Russia. Look what they're doing with their legislation. Look how they're embracing Christian values kind of societally, collectively. Maybe we can, imitate them in some way, or even, copy some of their approaches. And I think that's what's going to happen in the future. It'll be this confrontation between this progressive degenerate ideology and this Eastern Orthodox reality that's growing in the East. And, can you embrace it locally in the West? Absolutely. Whether or not the West will be will also become another beacon of Orthodox Christianity. I think that's probably something that's maybe on the table for the next century, but I guess we'll see. And Ukraine, of course, is the major challenge here. If Russia, and I mean to say this as a Russian, but if Russia does fail in Ukraine now, all of these sort of positive things may be delayed somewhat, maybe perhaps even significantly. If the forces of NATO and the forces of world liberalism do prevail, I think things will look quite dire in the future. But, through prayer and through effort, I think Orthodox Christianity will kind of win out in the end, as the saints tell us and as Christ told us himself. So,
well, we got book recommendations before I even had to ask from Conrad. And Conrad, you're free, of course, to give any more. But Dmitry, do you have any book recommendations? Listeners always like these things.
Well, I think it may come off as a bit of a cliche, but now that we're seeing all these, as Conrad mentioned, the world is heating up in some way. We do see conflict all around the globe, or even tensions, cold tensions. Maybe, we'll see China and Taiwan, we'll see. And I wouldn't recommend Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. I think it's a little bit outdated. Maybe it's okay as a text, but I think Alexander Dugin's book on geopolitics is, I think, a must read, only because you do need to understand. And, by you, I mean, to any of the listeners listening, it is just a foundational text, which is, by the way, it's being taught in Russian military schools. Even, the basic sort of personnel training in the Russian military and officer schools are reading this book. It's, it's only about 150 pages, but it does give you a good outlook of exactly how geopolitics work and what geopolitics are. I think Dugin was one of the first people who actually coined the term geopolitics. And, this is the reality we're all going to face in the future as the tectonic plates of world politics shift and move around, and we see alignments and wars and diplomatic tensions. I think it's very important for us to understand what's happening.
Awesome. I'll link to that. And Conrad, do you have any more?
Oh man, if I could go on this for 2 hours,
Me too.
But I think I've got some right here. I'll just show. I mean, this is a book I tell everybody to read: Cosmos and Transcendence by Wolfgang Smith. He's a MIT Columbia professor. This is one of the books. If you are against scientism and you want to actually this is literally called breaking through the barrier of scientific belief. If you want to fundamentally challenge every single thing and every single presupposition about the modern world and science that read this book. It's full of huge words that you won't understand the first time you read it, but it's really short, so you can get through it in a week. This is a good book I've been reading. It was recommended by a follower of our show. This is A Ray of Light. This is from Jordanville. Yeah. It's about by Archimandrite Panteleimon, who founded Holy Trinity Monastery, and it's basically his instructions on piety for the end of the world. So I think those are two things people would enjoy reading. I recommended those two books earlier: History of Central Banking. Yeah. Everybody who considers themselves in any way woke or woke up to what's going on red-pilled needs to read that book. The Spiridonovich book is good. I always recommend The Departure of the Soul by St. Anthony's Monastery if you were shaky on the Orthodox doctrine of the toll houses. Oh, okay. That's getting into another topic of discussion. So if y'all read those books, I think you'll understand where I'm coming from a bit more.
Yeah. Excellent. That's at least one I was not familiar with. I love doing that. And plug away anything. Well, I mean, I guess it's the Substack and the YouTube site, but plug anything y'all need to, and Twitter, of course.
Well, I think it's most importantly, follow the World War Now Substack. Of course, it'll be I think in the description of the podcast, and I think this is the most important probably avenue for some of our content provided, and some of our guests, Buck Johnson and Jim Jatras and other people. But this is where we'll be publishing our articles, posting the podcast episodes. But we also have individual Twitter accounts through which we post some of our own personal opinions. So you can follow Gnomrad, Gnomerad. Gnomrad is Conrad. And of course, myself, Dmitry Kalyagin. You could follow me at O-Canonist, so Orthodox Canonist. And as well as our general Twitter page, World War Now _ on Twitter. And we post some pretty groundbreaking news over there regarding the current geopolitical conflict, as well as some of the ecclesiological Orthodox related material you may not find anywhere else, frankly. At the moment, we've had some pretty good posts. And just as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel if you'd like. We do post audio versions of our podcast there. So if you'd like to watch it in the YouTube format, you're welcome to do so. So World War Now on YouTube.
Yeah, and Conrad, y'all got a Telegram group, don't you?
Yeah, I was going to say the Telegram, World War Now Tele, World War Now TELE at the end. That's where, you won't get censored there. So that's a good place to always have that in the back pocket in case, we get totally shut down everywhere else. But yeah, worldwarnow.substack.com. really helps us out. We write articles too, so you'll get all those in your email if you get those. So yeah, thank you so much, Buck. This is great.
Man, thank you guys. This has been really good. And I know there's a lot of people that are stoked that all three of us finally came together. Dmitry, Conrad, thank you guys so much for being here on Counterflow.
Thank you, Buck.
Yes,
God
sir.
bless.
You too. All right, I've spoken to y'all in the past about this exclusive club over at patreon.com/counterflow for $5 or more per month. You're in the club. And what that will get you is a monthly Zoom call with myself, a guest or two, as it were last time, and all of you. And so the January one was fabulous. And I said this many times, but just to reiterate, it's not going to be in the podcast feed. It will not be on the Rumble page, the YouTube page. It will be a private Zoom call where we can discuss things openly and honestly. There's no censorship unless I just decide to can ya. But other than that, there's no censorship and it's not recorded at all. And we had a very good open dialogue in January on that Zoom call. And I've already got a guest in mind for the February one. And I will let y'all know once all of the club members, this exclusive patreon.com/counterflow members, all of them get the info and they will get notified when this is going to happen. So join up, join the club. Counterflowpodcast.com is the website. I'm on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. And I think that's about it. That's all I got. You guys have an awesome week. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.